The Vigil Keeper. There is a kind of silence that only exists in deep space. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of a held breath, but the silence of true absence, where sound has never existed at all and never will. For 141 years, that silence was the only company captain Amara Voss had ever truly known. The generation ship Meridian had left Earth's orbit in the year 2041, carrying 11,000 souls toward a star system that promised a second chance for humanity. It was never meant to drift, it was never meant to fail. But 6 years into the voyage, a radiation storm tore through the ship's primary reactor housing, and what followed was not the dramatic, fiery death that films had always promised. It was worse, it was slow, it was quiet. Systems failed one by one, like an old house losing its lights room by room, until the only thing standing between 11,000 sleeping colonists and the void was a single crew member who refused, against every reasonable argument, to lie down and sleep beside them. Amara Voss was 26 years old when the storm hit. She was not the ship's captain by rank; that honor belonged to a man named Greyer, who was in cryosleep with the rest of the command staff when the disaster struck, trusting the automated systems to wake him if anything went wrong. But the automated systems, as automated systems sometimes do, made a judgment call. They calculated that reviving the full crew would drain resources faster than a skeleton watch could sustain. They calculated that one engineer alone stood the best chance of keeping just enough systems alive to give everyone else a future. They woke Amara Voss and only Amara Voss, and they told her the truth without softening it. She could go back into the pod and die with everyone else in 100 years when the reactor finally gave out completely, or she could stay awake alone and try to keep it breathing. She stayed awake. What the ship's records do not adequately capture, what no log entry, however detailed, can properly convey, is what 141 years of solitude actually does to a human mind. Amara did not remain 26. The Meridian's medical bay kept her alive through slow-aging treatments never designed for this kind of duration, treatments that were meant to buy years, not lifetimes, stretched and rationed and reused until her hair had gone the color of frost and her hands had learned every groove and flaw of every wall on that ship as intimately as a blind woman knows her own home. She talked to the ship. She gave the reactor a name, Samuel, after her grandfather, and she scolded it when it sputtered and thanked it when it held. She walked the same corridors so many thousands of times that her footsteps had begun, almost imperceptibly, to wear grooves into certain floor panels. She read every book stored in the ship's archive, some of them a dozen times over. She talked to the sleeping faces behind the cryopod glass as though they could hear her, telling them about her day, telling them jokes, telling them she was sorry it was taking so long, telling them to hold on just a little longer. She never once considered letting the reactor die. It would have been easier. There were nights, if the concept of night meant anything inside a ship with no windows and no sun, when the temptation to simply stop, to let exhaustion win, to climb into an empty pod and sleep the true sleep instead of the 4-hour naps she rationed herself, pressed against her like a physical weight. But every time that weight settled onto her chest, she would walk to the observation deck, place her palm against the reinforced glass and look out at the 11,000 futures suspended in ice around her. And she would find, somewhere in the marrow of herself, one more reason to keep going. This is the story of what happened when someone finally came looking. They called themselves the Vessai, though that was only the closest approximation the Meridian's translation algorithms could manage of a concept that did not fully exist in human language, something closer to the ones who weigh or the ones who judge the worth of what remains. The Vessai were an old species, older than most of the galaxy's spacefaring civilizations, and they had appointed themselves, or perhaps been appointed in some manner lost to their own deep history, as a kind of galactic hospice service. Their function, as best as anyone could determine, was to find dying things, dying ships, dying colonies, dying species clinging to the last gasp of their civilization. And when the Vessai found them, they made a determination. Was this thing worth saving, or was it kinder in the end to let it go? The Vessai vessel that found the Meridian was called, in the flattened phonetics of human speech, the Aleph Ka. It was vast and dark and slow, built more like a cathedral than a warship, and it had been drawn toward the Meridian's dying reactor signature the way a moth is drawn toward a guttering candle. The being who came aboard, the Vessai, did not have a single leader in the human sense, but this one held some manner of authority, some rank the translators rendered simply as witness, expected to find exactly what the Vessai always found in situations like this one. A tomb. A slow-motion grave drifting through the dark, its inhabitants either already dead or so close to death that ending their suffering would be the only mercy left to offer. The witness did not expect to find Amara Voss standing in the reactor bay, wrench in hand, glaring up at an intruder 11 feet tall with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that held no pupils at all, only slow-swirling galaxies of soft light. "You are alive," the witness said, once the translation matrices had calibrated themselves to her language. Its voice, rendered through the Meridian speakers, carried an odd quality, not quite surprise, because surprise required expectation to be violated in a way the Vessai, in their long existence, rarely experienced anymore. It was closer to genuine puzzlement. "Very much so," Amara said. She did not lower the wrench. "And so are 10,999 other people on this ship, if my equipment's still reading right, which it mostly is, though the sensors on Deck 4 have been lying to me for about 30 years now." "They are not alive," the witness said. "They are suspended. Their biological processes have been halted. In the classification systems of my people, this ship should be logged as a failure. A funeral barge. I came to determine whether ending its journey now cleanly would spare further suffering." Amara set the wrench down on the console beside her, very deliberately, the way a person sets down a weapon, not because they no longer feel threatened, but because they have decided that whatever happens next, they intend to face it with empty, open hands. "Let me explain something to you," she said. "You can log this ship as whatever you want. You can call it a funeral barge if that's the word that fits your paperwork. But I've walked these halls for 141 years. I know every name behind every one of those pods. I know the little girl in Bay 6 who was supposed to see her 7th birthday 2 years after launch, and I've been keeping account for her. A birthday cake made of nothing but a candle I light on the anniversary date, because that's the only kind of cake I've got left to give her. I know the couple in Bay 11 who got married 4 days before departure and never got a wedding night because the storm hit before they were even out of their honeymoon quarters. I know all of them. And not one of them is dead. Suspended isn't dead. Waiting isn't dead. I would know. I've been doing both in my own way for longer than you've probably paid attention to a single dying thing before deciding it wasn't worth the effort." The witness was silent for a long moment. Something in its posture, a subtle recalibration, a stillness that had not been there before, suggested that this was not a conversation it had anticipated having. "You have been alone," it finally said, "for 141 of your years. Alone in this dying vessel, maintaining systems no other member of your species could see, receiving no relief, no support, no promise that your effort would ever be rewarded or even witnessed." "That's about the size of it, yeah." "Why?" Amara almost laughed. It It was not a question she had ever needed to answer before because there had never been anyone to ask it. Because somebody had to, she said. Because I woke up one day and the ship told me I was the only one who could keep the lights on, and once you know that, once you actually know it, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to sleep knowing that if you do, everyone else sleeps forever, so you get up. And then the next day you get up again. And you keep getting up every single day for as long as it takes because the alternative isn't rest. The alternative is letting 10,000 people die so that one person could feel less tired. The witness moved closer, its long limbs folding and unfolding in a manner that human eyes found difficult to track, until it stood directly before her, studying her with those slow swirling eyes as though she were a text written in a language it was only now, for the first time in centuries, learning to read. Among my people, it said, there is an old story, older than our current form of governance, older than the practice that brought me to your vessel today. It concerns a being called the Last Warden who is said to have guarded a dying garden long after every other gardener had given up and gone home, tending a single seed through centuries of drought because she could not bring herself to believe it was truly finished. The story is not literal. We do not believe such a being existed exactly as described. It is used to teach the young the difference between a duty performed and a duty that has become identity, between someone who does a task and someone who has become in every meaningful sense indistinguishable from the task itself. We call this state Kalathresh. It is considered among my people the rarest and most sacred configuration a mind can achieve. We had believed until this moment that only Vessai were capable of it. I don't know your word for it, Amara said. We'd probably just call it stubbornness. It is not stubbornness, the witness said, and for the first time something in its measured, ancient voice shifted into a register that might in a human throat have been called reverence. Stubbornness is refusal without cost. This, what you have done, has cost you a century of your single, unrepeatable life, and you would do it again. I can see that you would do it again without hesitation if given the choice a second time. Every time, Amara said quietly, every single time. The witness turned then and moved to the observation window, looking out at the cryopod bay the way Amara herself had looked at it 10,000 times, and it was quiet for long enough that Amara began to wonder if the conversation, whatever it had been, was over. I came here to end a tragedy, the witness finally said. My people have judged 962 dying vessels across our long history, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, mercy meant conclusion. Suffering, once it exceeds a certain threshold, is rarely redeemed by additional suffering. This is not cruelty on our part. It is, we believe, the deepest form of compassion available to beings who cannot restore what has already been broken. But Amara said. But I did not find a tragedy, the witness said. I found a vigil, and my people do not end vigils. We have never in all our recorded history encountered one that endured this long, sustained by a single unbroken will. We assumed such devotion belonged only to legend. You have shown me that we were wrong to assume this, and I confess that is not a correction my people receive gracefully or often. It was in this moment, standing in a dying reactor bay 141 years from the world she had once called home, that Amara Voss allowed herself, for the first time since the storm, to cry not from grief, which she had long since made a kind of permanent roommate, but from something closer to disbelief, the strange vertigo of being seen after so long being certain that no one ever would be. What followed took the Vessai 11 days, though to Amara, half delirious with something that felt dangerously close to hope, it felt like both an eternity and no time at all. The Alethkaz engineers, if that word even applied to beings who seemed to shape matter through something closer to conversation than construction, repaired the Meridian's failing reactor not by replacing it, but by teaching it, coaxing dying systems back into function with techniques that made Amara's century of jury-rigged patches look, in her own quiet estimation, like a child's crayon drawing beside a cathedral fresco. They did not simply fix what was broken. They asked Amara again and again what she wanted preserved. what mattered to her, which systems held meaning beyond their function, and rebuilt the ship not as the Vessai would have built it, but as she needed it to remain recognizable, hers, still the ship she had spent a lifetime keeping alive rather than a stranger's replacement wearing its name. On the 11th day, Amara Voss stood in the cryopod bay, her hand resting against the release mechanism of Pod 6, where a little girl named Priya had been sleeping since she was 5 years old, and she allowed herself, finally, to press it. The wave of revivals that followed took the better part of a month. Staggered carefully so the ship's newly restored, but still limited resources could support the transition. Captain Grow woke first, groggy and disoriented, to find that the 26-year-old engineer he remembered from the ship's roster was now a woman in her 167th year, standing at the foot of his pod with tired eyes and an exhausted, radiant smile, and that somewhere in the century he had slept through, she had single-handedly rewritten what it meant to survive. He did not know what to say to her. There are no protocols for this. No training manual prepares a captain to wake up and discover that the crew member with the lowest rank on his roster has, through sheer unbroken will, become the reason everyone else on the ship still has a pulse. So he did the only thing that felt adequate, which was almost nothing at all. He simply stood and took her hand and held it, and said her name like it was something sacred, because by then, to everyone who would eventually learn what she had done, it was. Priya, when she woke, was still 5 years old in every way that mattered, and she did not understand, not fully, why the tall silver-haired stranger who greeted her wept when she smiled, not until years later when she was old enough to be told the truth, that this stranger had lit a candle for her on every one of her missed birthdays, alone in an empty room for over 100 years, simply so that someone somewhere would still be counting. The Vessai did not leave once the last of the 11,000 had woken. The witness remained, and in time others of its kind followed, drawn not by the Meridian's dying signal, for it no longer dies, no longer signals distress, but by something closer to curiosity, the same curiosity that draws any traveler toward a place where something remarkable has happened. Humanity's first true contact with a spacefaring civilization was not, in the end, a negotiation of trade routes or a demonstration of weapons or a desperate plea for survival. It was one exhausted woman, standing alone in the dark, refusing to let go, and a species built to judge whether dying things deserved to continue, discovering that they had, for the first time in their long and careful history, found something that had already answered that question for itself, 141 years before anyone thought to ask. Amara Voss lived another 40 years after the Meridian finally reached orbit around the world it had been promised in 2041, more than a century and a half late. She never fully explained, even to those closest to her, what those decades of solitude had cost her, because some costs are not meant to be explained, only carried, and eventually laid down. But every year, on the anniversary of the day she pressed the release on Pod 6, Priya would find her wherever she was and bring her a candle, and the two of them would sit together and light it and say nothing at all, because by then there was nothing that needed saying. The Vessai, for their part, revised their oldest teachings. The story of the last warden was no longer told as legend. It was given a new ending, added by the witness itself and passed down to every young Vessai who came after, that once in the long history of the galaxy the wardens had been found to be real and that they had been human. End.